reasons. The government then uses the power at its disposal to support and/or sustain those identified industries. What sorts of options do governments have to support critically important industries? Subsidizing is one of the most popular. This is a direct payment, financial support for the industry to guarantee that it can remain competitive and stay in business. Tariffs can be placed on foreign products that otherwise would compete with the industry. Those tariffs are taxes that raise the price of foreign goods and make American-produced goods more competitive. Restrictive legislation on what can enter the country, or simply using tax policy to the advantage of select industries. What sorts of industries are supported by the U.S. government? The first category would be underlying or foundational industries, the sorts of industries upon which other industries, businesses, and livelihoods depend. National defense is a pretty obvious industry that any government would want to preserve and protect. And then finally, as we've seen more recently, in times of healthcare crises, such as a global pandemic, the medical industries must be shielded and promoted. The question, however, is when are we crossing the line? We have a pretty good sense of what capitalist economic philosophy is, beginning with Adam Smith in 1776 and moving forward. Far too often people assume that capitalism does not believe in government. That would be Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, among her many classics, in which she argued government is almost always intrusive and in the way, and that capitalism can only exist in a pure form if there is no government at all. Reading Adam Smith, it is clear that government is necessary. Someone has to write the rules of economic engagement, enforce contracts that are violated, and yes, provide support for the general population, for example, through national defense, or perhaps these foundational industries, and I think everyone can agree that if there is an immediate health crisis, government intervention on behalf of certain industries does indeed serve the whole without violating the basic principles of capitalism. But what is outside the bounds? At what point are we no longer functioning like a capitalist economy? What sorts of industries should never be supported by the government if that government is to preserve our capitalist integrity? Certainly, any of those that are supported for purely political interest would be outside the bounds of acceptability. Maybe the supply chain crisis that we are currently experiencing, which is to a large extent a matter of convenience for American consumers. Let's then look at that supply chain situation. The goods that we buy are produced locally and internationally, although increasingly Americans are purchasing foreign goods, widgets and gidgets, as the old economic books used to call products. They come to our shores from somewhere else. And of course, they don't originate there. There is a massive global supply chain of producers, assemblers, designers. The raw materials come from one location, they move to another one, probably in another country, for initial manufacturing, and they make their way through the system. We can find the point of origin. We can trace every single product all the way through the global system until it makes its way to its destination. And of course, this is a gross simplification of what the global supply chain really looks like, because each of those mid-destination points is also where other parts of the product are going to arrive. The leading economic philosophy today is called just-in-time strategy. You want the pieces to arrive just in time for assembly so the increasingly finished product can move to its next point of production. Because of that, if there is a disruption anywhere in the system, it could be an armed conflict among nations, it could be a global pandemic, it could be an earthquake or hurricane, it could be a new government just changing policy. it has profound implications throughout the global supply chain. The so-called ripple effect creates massive disruptions in the arrival of goods. That is what we've experienced in the last 2 years. One reason there is a global supply chain is because we purchase more and more of our products from abroad. Maybe part of the product or the entire product is assembled, manufactured, packaged, and shipped from across boundaries. If we go back in time, just a few generations, overwhelmingly Americans purchased and consumed American supplied goods. Made in America meant something, and America was a country that was largely self-sufficient. But over time, as you can see from this graph, the portion of the things that we consume that are made abroad has increased. Also, the volume of what we have consumed, what we purchase, has increased. So today, a majority of the items that we find in local stores are manufactured abroad. That makes us highly vulnerable to any disruptions in the global supply chain. Trade deals are a very big reason for that. The globalization of liberal economic policies, and by liberal, I mean capitalism and free trade. If we look at the rise of free trade agreements, bilateral, regional, and international, they align pretty closely with the foreign origin of supplies. The broader we place this global trading network, the more local economies can provide material, labor, sourcing, and production of the goods that we consume. Manufacturing here in the United States, as a result, has been in severe decline. And that is something that we see throughout the Western world. It is the maturation of societies and economies. We evolved from an agrarian subsistence economy to a self-sustaining industrial society to post-industrial and now largely a service society. That means almost all the things that we buy have foreign origins. Economics from a capitalist perspective is pretty straightforward. This is your classic supply-demand graph. If supply and demand meet at that point is called equilibrium, the price of the product will be reasonable. However, if the demand increases without an increase in supply, we're going to see an increase in the price of that product. There are fewer widgets and gadgets available compared to the demand for them. Generally speaking, according to capitalism and Adam Smith, there's an invisible hand that fixes this problem. Either the production will increase or new suppliers will join the market, and in so doing, that returns the point to equilibrium. No need for government intervention. The invisible hand is the rational self-interest of individuals and corporations responding to market demands and opportunities. It is the beauty and the majesty of capitalism. Everyone pursues their own self-interest, and in so doing, every good and every service needed by society will be provided. We do have crises of supply and demand. We saw that beginning in early 2020, when suddenly everyone in the world needed a mask because of COVID. A shock to the international system that pushed the demand to an extreme to the point that supply could never keep up. COVID and global pandemics have that sort of an impact on the supply-demand charts. So here is our crisis in 2020. There's an enormous demand for masks and other protective gear. The supply simply cannot keep up. Market forces alone do not allow us to generate the production needed to meet the needs of the American society, not to mention the world, when it comes to protective gear such as masks. Government intervention was needed. The government had to direct existing industries to begin to produce gloves, masks, gowns for those who are on the front line, and all sorts of other high-demand items on the market. Our supply chain crisis has many stress points. A large number of them are overseas. Simply put, overseas markets are having a difficult time keeping up with demand. Disruptions from the pandemic or other external events have caused disruptions in the supply chain. But even when products reach American shores, there are more supply chain stress points. Our ports of call are overwhelmed. From Jacksonville to Seattle, Los Angeles to Boston, we cannot find enough workers, and there doesn't seem to be enough time in the day to process all of the arriving international goods. And so those ships begin to pile up offshore, which of course costs money, and it raises the price of the goods. But even once they get inside the port system, we have a crisis of delivery in the United States. We are woefully understaffed in key industries, including transportation, such as trucking. Capitalism has a very simple answer for that. The market will correct this problem when truck drivers are paid a higher salary and better benefits, perhaps provided better job conditions. But to date, we've not been able to keep up with the decline in the number of truckers. So at all points in the system, from your local grocery store to the foreign point of origin, there are stress points in the global supply chain, and capitalism to date does not seem to be able to fix them all. Why do we have this crisis? Well, a part of it, and I wouldn't say an overwhelming part of it, but certainly a portion of the reason is our relationship with China. Under the Trump administration, and continued into the Biden administration, we've been trying to disengage to some extent from China. We have placed tariffs on Chinese products, quotas on their imports, out of a concern that China is not playing by the rules. It is cheating to get an advantage, and also out of a concern that many things that China produces are of critical importance for the United States, for our military, our automobile industry, our energy infrastructure. We're simply giving China too much leverage over the well-being of the United States. Some disentanglement of this trade relationship needs to happen. The global consumption surge that's been underway since the Cold War ended. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the rise of a truly global trading network, and with China's entry into it, many high-population countries have become wealthier. There's a very clear relationship between liberal economic policy, meaning capitalism, open markets, and free trade, and economic prosperity. With prosperity comes consumption, whether it's houses, Rolex watches, or any point in between. That surge places a lot of pressure on the global supply chain. Since COVID has begun to end, there's been a buying spree, especially in the Western world, but really globally, that has overwhelmed the supply chain industry. And finally, here in the United States, what is called the Great Resignation. For a host of reasons, Americans are not going back to work. When this lecture was taped in early November 2021, we were at an all-time high for Americans out of the workplace, by their own volition. Maybe they learned something because of COVID, that the stress just isn't worth it, that the rat race isn't paying off. For whatever reason, they're beginning to value staying at home, and millions of Americans are choosing to do exactly that. And if we're short in staff, it's very difficult to get products to the shelf and into the consumer's hands. For these reasons, we have a supply chain crisis in 2021 that's likely to still be ongoing as you watch this lecture. We now turn to economic philosophy, the policies that we choose in making our domestic and foreign policy. The most essential economic debate is between mercantilism on one end and free trade on the other. This is not a light switch. You're not really one or the other. Most countries are somewhere in between, the gradations. China is a mercantilist nation. It maximizes its exports with a lot of government assistance, and it minimizes its imports with a lot of protection measures provided by Beijing. In so doing, China is able to accumulate a very large amount of money. It has a trade imbalance in its favor, exporting a great deal, importing very little. For every product that the U.S. sends to China, China sends 4 products to the United States. That means American dollars are piling up in China. It can use those dollars to subsidize its industries. It can also use them to build the global economic system that it's been working on for several years now. $1.54 trillion in the new Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative. Japan since 1945 has acted like a mercantilist country. We have allowed Japan to do this. We've given it what we call infant market protections, allowing it to regenerate itself after the devastation of World War II in the hopes that it would move from mercantilist towards a free trade approach. For the most part, Japan has not done that. For much of its first century in existence, the United States was also a mercantilist power. After World War II, we went all in on the free trade side, both for us and the international system. And as the leading state, the most impressive country after World War II, we were able to require nations to pursue free trade policies. That process began at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the United States met with its allies before the Second World War had even ended. And what we said to them was unlike the statement of any emerging hegemon in modern history. Normally, when a country becomes the dominant power, it takes territory and privileges away from the other powers. The United States of Bretton Woods did the exact opposite. We said to our allies, you'll keep your territory, we'll open our markets to you so that you can build your economies with the expectation that someday you will open your markets to us. It was a stunning development and one of the most important events of the 20th century. So how exactly does this free trade philosophy work? Here we have a number of nation states. Some of them are trading freely with one another. In so doing, they form an informal alliance of free trade nations, and they behave differently. Normally, countries that trade with each other do not go to war with each other. As nations on the outside begin to observe, see the accumulation of wealth among the free traders, the lack of war among them, it decides to join the group, to change its stripes, and to become a free trade nation. Conflicts that occur are largely between the free trade nations and the non-free trade, or fully outside of the free trade alliance. Those countries as well can realize that if they trade freely, adopt capitalist economic philosophies, they'll be more peaceful at home and also more prosperous as well. So by this point, almost the entire world is inside this free trade agreement. Two nations, as you can see, are refusing to play along. Those are mercantilist nations. And of course, they're not using free trade policies. They're the outliers in the system. Japan and China are the classic examples. What we have decided to do is to embrace them and to allow them to join the free trade network, even though they're behaving like mercantilist nations. This is a very big risk because they are greatly advantaged by their mercantilist policies, yet they have access to our economic markets. So how did China get here? I explained Japan earlier, post-World War II, allow them to develop, we give them a lot of latitude. That's not the case with China. It begins with the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Deng Xiaoping and other technocrats succeeded him and took a much more pragmatic view to economics. They created specialized economic zones along the coastline that functioned like free trade regions within a communist country. Cold War ended, global trade markets expanded, China was allowed into the World Trade Organization and given highly favorable terms of trade, under the assumption that by joining the WTO, it would adopt free trade policies. It clearly has not. As we look at the global supply chain today, China is at the center of many of the paths of production and shipment, and that translates into a great deal of leverage for the People's Republic of China. That is why industrial policy is a great decision. It affects our national security and economic well-being. One example of China's dominance and its leverage is that of rare earth elements. So these are elements, a dozen, two, maybe three of them, that are found in very low concentrations in the ground, but they're absolutely essential for all things electronic. They're a very valued commodity. China today produces 85% of the world's rare earth metals. And that means if it were to decide to boycott or simply consume them all rather than shipping them abroad, our economic system would face a very severe shortage of many important supply items. So what explains this? Because 50 years ago, we were the dominant rare earth supplier to the world's markets. And over the course of these decades, it has absolutely collapsed. One reason is the environment. As noted earlier, low concentrations means you have to dig up a lot of dirt in order to find enough rare earth metals to be productive. We value our environment. Secondly, as seemingly as when we would decline in production, China would simply take our place, so the market provided the rare earth metals that we needed. And also a healthy dose of short-sightedness, not realizing how this momentum would build over time. China, on the other hand, has risen to the dominant level in rare earth metals. Governments have directed the population and industry to dig up and produce rare earth. The Chinese have purchased third-party areas in other countries, and the Chinese have been playing the long game, seeking to develop leverage over the United States, over Japan, and over the Western world by dominating rare earth metals, and as you can see, they have succeeded. Having considered these three items, we now turn to U.S. foreign policy options. There are three of them: renewed engagement, decoupling of economies, or the adoption of a new industrial policy. What does renewed engagement mean? Well, we go back to the earlier graph. Global free trade network. Most countries are categorized as free traders, with the two obvious outliers. This strategy says keep doing what we're doing. Continue to trade in order to draw in the outliers, and hopefully they will change their color and one day open their markets to free and fair trade. Very few Americans have optimism that this will happen, and almost no one has the patience to wait long enough to see if it will. So the traditional American policy since 1945, create the global trading system, open your markets to foreign trade, and wait out all of the outliers, seems to have run its course. Even though China is a member of the World Trade Organization, it is not adopting the deep and free trade rules of the WTO. And as a result, it's pretty easy to conclude that renewed engagement simply will not work. It's also clear that the Biden administration has reached that conclusion because most of the previous Trump policies on China continue throughout 2021. Okay, how about another option, decoupling? This is a bit involved. Stage one, we begin to shift supply chains to others, trying to avoid supply chains that run through China. Stage number two, significant export restrictions on technology. It's already illegal to ship many high-tech items abroad, such as powerful computers. This would strengthen those rules and expand them to other areas where the Chinese may be copying our technology, mass producing it without all the R&D investment, and then making a profit on it. Stage 3, countervailing and anti-dump duties. This means targeting China for its anti-free trade actions relative to its own domestic production. They're dumping when they're selling products below fair market value in order to run businesses out of the market. Then they can dominate that market. And finally, there is stage 4, restricting our foreign investments. These are corporate and private investments that are being sent to China, and restricting the number of Chinese FDIs that are allowed here in the United States. You can see why this second strategy is called decoupling. We're trying to disengage from the Chinese economy. With each and every one of these steps, there will be a counter-Chinese proposal. They will work to harm us for any problems we cause in their economic approach. Mr. Biden, Mr. Xi, you can see them there meeting, a summit-level event. A lot of issues on the table, highly unlikely that those two leaders will agree on either re-engagement or decoupling. Here you can see China's new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, waterways, land routes across the international system, and reaching deep into Europe. It appears that China is well on its way to creating its own supply chain. Our last policy option is an industrial policy. And this in and of itself doesn't tell us a lot because it really depends on how ambitious we're going to be. On the least ambitious side, well, we would target a few sectors, really important ones, and we would help those industries reconfigure. Provide them with the incentives, the resources, the tax breaks so they can upgrade their facilities and become more competitive with other countries. On the ambitious side is to fundamentally change the country's economic infrastructure. Either one of those will require a massive amount of government intervention, a very heavy hand in the economy, one that we have not seen in more than a century. Should we decide to be ambitious, we are going to move significantly down the path towards mercantilism. And while people can argue this is a short-term policy for a desperately needed fix, it is very difficult to move from left to right on this economic spectrum. It's much easier to move from right to left. So we should take this with a grain of salt. The temptation of pouring money into key industries so that they can be competitive globally, knowing that that is going to abandon basic economic philosophies relating to capitalism. 3 difficult choices, and that is why this is a great decision in 2022. We've now completed all 8 traditional great decisions topics. There is one bonus lecture that I'll ask you to stay tuned for. We'll look at the Biden foreign policy agenda. Until then, thank you for attending, stay engaged, and make great decisions. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. There are 9 topics in this masterclass. We are now at the point of looking at topic number 7, which is drug policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. We have declared war on a number of entities over time. If we look back to the early 1940s, there was the declaration of war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis powers of World War II. There was a declaration of war on illicit drugs in the 1970s, and a declaration of war against global terror. Most recently, we've declared war on COVID. So what this tells us is that declarations of war are mere words. The question is what sort of policies underwrite them, give them life, and allow us to achieve our national interests. Before we can consider American foreign policy options, there are three main considerations. We're going to look at the bureaucratic landscape of dealing with international drug policy, the extent of the problem from Latin